Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading from the One Year Bible. My name's Stephen Mizell, and Jay Rivenbark and I are joined today by Alyssa Bream, and we're looking at a passage from Daniel chapter 4, and we're asking some questions, a big discussion around the sovereignty of God. What does God's sovereignty look like? How much control does he have? Does he have control over nations and leaders and rulers? And I think that's important. And then how humility is important for our perspective, that either we can be practice humility or we can be humbled, but one of the two is going to be true. So I hope you grab your Bible and a pen and paper, and let's have a conversation around the Word of God today. Hey everyone, we're back in the book of Daniel today for our daily reading, Daniel chapter 4, and the theme is how pride is humbled by God's sovereignty. And so Nebuchadnezzar tells his own story. It's a king who's brought low until he recognizes God's supreme rule. And the might of the empire collapses before heaven's sovereignty. Is there a piece of this story that stuck out to you guys that you say, man, I want to make sure we talk about this verse or this piece today?
One of the things that I think can kind of get confusing here is Nebuchadnezzar's worldview was polytheistic. And so, because we see him talking about God in different places and saying about how he understands God's power, but I think he's understanding God as one of the powers in his worldview. And really the knowledge he needed to come to was God is the power, not one of the powers. So as you're reading these stories of these kings who maybe are partially acknowledging God, that's kind of a helpful framework to have.
Yeah, for me, it was the fact that even Nebuchadnezzar, at the end of this chapter, acknowledges the fact that God is able to humble the proud. And we've talked a lot about humility in previous podcasts, and that theme continues to run through, and that ultimately God is supreme, he's sovereign, he answers to no one, and even the hardest of hearts, those that we look at as being beyond God's reach, are susceptible to him working in such a way that he brings about his truth to them and even humility in their lives.
You know, Alyssa, you talked about being polytheistic. One, that's not unbiblical, right? The psalmist and even Job lends itself. Some people don't like to use the word God and gods, but the psalmist, I think it's Psalm 82, where it talks about the Elohim and the Elohims, so they're the little gods. I don't even think that we make the claim that there's not other powers in play. There's only one true power. There's one power that's overall, one true God. And that's a podcast all by itself. But I think people get confused sometimes when they hear people speak in spiritual terms, and they're making all gods on the same playing field without distinguishing the one true power. And because we may be more comfortable talking about princes or demons or those kind of things, whatever your language is. That we all fall prey to the other God syndrome, but we have to always land back on the one true God. So this concept of sovereignty, that God is sovereign over all. Before I ask the question about Nebuchadnezzar, how do you define sovereignty?
Ultimate authority, control, power, highest order would be some of those things that I think fit into sovereignty.
Yeah, I would go with that complete control idea.
I don't want this to spiral out of control. But when you talk about control, because I think dominion is easy for us to understand. Rule, authority is easy for us to understand. Control is where I think people get a little uncomfortable with this whole sovereignty issue. Because, well, if he's in control, why don't he do X? Why does he allow these things to happen? When you say control, what does that mean? There are some things that come to my mind, but what do you think that means?
Two initial thoughts. One, as it relates to God and control, he does what he chooses, when he chooses, how he chooses. Or the other part of that, which I think creates the challenge for people, he allows, which is also control. If he's in control, he can allow whatever comes and happens. And lots of times it leads people, us, to question why, if God is sovereign, if he is in control, why these things happen. And the very probably overly simplistic answer is that he allows, which is an aspect of control.
I think it's a mystery. I think we have to just sit in that tension sometimes of that God is sovereign, but still bad things happen. And the hard part is, and this is even in my notes for today, the hard times are what teaches us lessons.
Yeah. The concept of sovereignty, the whole polytheism, are there other gods? Is there one true God and other little gods, that are
monolatry?
Huh?
I think that's the word of, like, there's one main God and then other little gods.
Job brings that to the kind of forefront early. Obviously, it's the oldest book in the Bible. Bad things happen to Job, and God could have stopped them. He clearly had stopped them prior to, because Satan has to ask permission. Well, take the hedge away, take your hand off of his body, those kind of things. And I don't think we have the ability to understand, right? That's whether we call it a mystery or not. I just don't think we have the comprehension. Even if he revealed it to us, I think we would go, yeah, I still don't understand, if we saw it. Because even, I'll be honest with you, a few years back at Staff Retreat, I told you I was wrestling with this thing, that whole Elohims in Psalms really had me trapped. I was trying to understand completely, and I still don't completely understand it. But I think you can have authority and freedom at the same time. And I think that's what we miss, is that I think God has the ultimate authority, but he gives us freedom. We can have a conversation about free will and all of those other things, but I think he does. Freedom happens in the context of authority. And sometimes his control allows him to take those authorities away or impose them even more. And in this story, we find that God still has control over nations. The intriguing part about us recording these is we're at today in our daily reading as we record these, we're kind of at the end of Jeremiah. In the last few days in Jeremiah has been prophesying against Babylon. So he's been telling, all right, Babylon's going to take over Jerusalem, but there's going to come a time Babylon's going to fall. And it's interesting, Daniel is about that exile, what Jeremiah prophesied about. And, some of what Jeremiah is saying is God is using Babylon to extract judgment in his sovereignty on the nation of Israel and in Jerusalem. But there's going to come a time that they're going to suffer the same judgment. They're going to have to be dealt with. So what does Nebuchadnezzar's story reveal to us about God's control over nations?
I think the key point is what you said, that everything is under God's control, that sovereignty, that conversation we just had. But the phrase that stuck out to me as I was reading about Nebuchadnezzar and what happens to him with the lycanthropy. It was a year after the dream. There was a whole year. And you look at the things that happened before. There was this, all of a sudden, these men are eating vegetables and getting stronger than you. And then there's men thrown in a fiery furnace and they walk out perfectly fine. And you see another person in the fire.
And you recognize them, right? It looks like the Son of Man.
Right. And so there were all of these opportunities. And so that's really, as God is working in nations, I think there is grace and opportunity that he gives us. Sometimes we still just don't take it when we see it. And sometimes people are so hard-headed, like, or Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar. You know, Scripture even tells us not only, or as it relates to nations, God raises up certain leaders and brings certain ones down. And so he's sovereign in a nation, how he chooses to bless them or to pronounce judgment on them. So many times in Scripture, we see that he uses specific groups of people, including nations, to bring judgment on other groups. Sometimes he uses them to bless other groups. And so it just shows the ultimate authority and sovereignty of God, even on a global scale, to work and control. I almost use the word manipulate, has a negative connotation usually to it, but even to control world events, to ultimately bring about his plan and purpose, his glory and his honor, whatever he chooses.
Manipulate's not all that bad. I think it uses it in a negative connotation, but I have heard doctors use that term. You know, we're going to manipulate, something around over here and make this happen. Are all leaders appointed by God?
I'm convinced that some of them are back to that thing of God allows. You know, there'd be a difference in appoint and allow.
I've seen enough verses in the Bible and read them enough times that say about God sets the leaders and does all of that. And I've never seen one where it's like, and God let this leader slip through. And so
this one got by him.
Right.
But he gives people choice and decisions, for instance, in our nation. And so him allowing people to make choices and decisions is still a part of his sovereignty to choose. That may or may not have been
his choice.
Yeah.
So it's God's choice, except in democracy.
Sometimes he gives us over to ourselves, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, so I do think that maybe sometimes God allows us to have what we ask for, but if he didn't want it,
right,
he would still stop.
Yeah.
You
go back to the nation of Israel, they wanted a king. It wasn't God's plan. It wasn't what he wanted or desired, but he allowed it for those people to make that decision.
When I get to talking about stuff, other things come to my mind. Why do you think he allowed them to have a sucky one first?
Because this is not what he wanted to start with. He was like, if you want one.
He thought they would learn their lesson out of the gate and say, okay, we don't want one no more.
So we changed our mind. We're going to go back to your way. But perhaps, be careful what you ask for.
Yeah, I don't know. I've always wondered why Saul out of the gate, right? David, I mean, couldn't it have been somebody else out of the gate? Was there nobody better? I don't know. I know why the people wanted him.
Yeah.
It's clear. He was head and shoulders above everybody else. But, so this whole thing comes down to humility. And I think sometimes practicing humility is much better than being humbled. In my opinion, he was humbled. Yeah. He was not practicing humility.
Yeah.
So how can humbling, that might have been a better way to answer or to ask the question, how can humbling restore our perspective?
Humbling ourselves is an intentional act. Another podcast, I think Alyssa said, Thanksgiving was a big part of that, remembering where you come from, what God's done for you. And I think that's an ongoing process of humbling yourself. I made note in here 3 or 4 times where the phrase, when you have learned, until you have learned, until you learn, that that's where God literally forced him, as you said. He got humbled rather than humbling himself. And, I think back over my own life, there have been times I'm convinced what came into my life, God allowed it. So he humbled me. I'd rather much practice humility and be aware of it and humble myself along the way rather than have to have an event. But that's the thing that really resonated with me was the many times he said, when you've learned, until you've learned, you're just going to experience this.
Daniel, once again, when he was delivering this message, King Nebuchadnezzar was so humble and so deferential. Like I think this was a place where he was like, I wish I didn't have to give you this message, but this is really hard news. And I think that King Nebuchadnezzar had some really great reasons to be very proud. I didn't realize that one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world was built by him, the Hanging Gardens. I don't know, I've heard of the Hanging Gardens in different places, and I never put that together, that he was the one who built this majestic thing, but he took too much credit for it. He took, and so that word, by my own mighty power, I have built this city, is one thing. I've built this beautiful city is what he said. That's not completely altogether a false statement, but he didn't have that perspective and that humility in there. And we see what happens. He turned in. Lycanthropy is the word that is used in like medieval times for like the werewolves, but that's actually like a clinical term for people who think they are a wolf, and so that's what happens to him, basically, like thinking of it like a werewolf where he's just roaming around completely insane. It just really, I don't know, that it struck me this time of just thinking about him like.
Yeah, I have this picture of his hair growing out and him crawling around on the ground, slobbering everywhere.
Long fingernails,
yeah,
like claws, it says.
Just kind of spooky. And to think, right, here's the thing. If that happened in our society, that person never becomes king again.
Never gets back.
No, they never get back. I mean, I don't even like, that's not something that would happen in modern day.
Because I mean, for all practical reasons, he was, quote, insane. He even used the term, when my sanity returned to me.
Alyssa, to your point, I think humility keeps us from being the main character in the story. And we get humbled when we become the main character in the story, when we think everything revolves around us and it's about us. And I think that is an extremely dangerous place to be, and we have to be careful. And I think it requires some intentionality to guard against, because the natural inclination is to say, look what I've done, and not what he's done. Thank you for joining us again today on One Single Story. Just want to remind you, Nebuchadnezzar's fall, it wasn't punishment. It was an invitation for him to be able to understand who God was. God never humbles us to destroy us. He humbles us to restore glory where it belongs, and that is to him. So I hope you'll think about that as you go through your day. Hope you'll join us again on the next edition of One Single Story.